Dorothée Baumann-Pauly, you're about to launch the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, and a project which you instigated. Tell us about how this idea came about.
All right, well, thanks for doing this interview with me, and it's a pleasure to have you here. Our project started about 3-4 years ago, but I was actually involved in a Business and Human Rights Center in the US, so at the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights. I joined as the center was launched at NYU Stern in 2013 as their research director. And at the time, this was the very first Center for Business and Human Rights fully institutionalized at a business school. And we were proud to be the first one at NYU, but we, from the very beginning, said, well, to change business education so that human rights become an integral part of business education, we need many allies. And we very early on set our eyes on Geneva, which is the arguably the capital of human rights, and it's a logical place for an academic platform that could advance human rights in business education. So we're thrilled that we are starting a center here later this month officially.
And how will it be structured? How will it work in practice?
So they asked me to lead those efforts, but I have a small team with a couple of postdocs that will lead different work streams. And the funding currently comes from the University of Geneva that generously supports the seed, provides the seed funds for this project. And the postdocs, they will lead work streams in different industry sectors. We believe that human rights challenges are industry specific. So the classic case are sweatshops and global supply chains and the garment industry, electronics industry, or toy industry. But there are new challenges as well, for example, in the ICT sector, where the right to privacy and the right to freedom of expression are the most important human rights to be protected. And so we will have projects in different industry sectors that matter to Switzerland in particular. And so, of course, in Geneva, the finance industry and the commodity trading industry are important, and we have 2 initial projects in those 2 sectors.
Can you give us a bit more detail on some of those projects? I know you've got one collaboration with the University of Sydney.
Indeed, yeah. So the first project is a collaboration with the University of Sydney, which is a strategic partnership university to the University of Geneva. And we are looking to develop human rights benchmarks for the financial service sector. We want to do assessments of banks and insurance providers to see how are they currently talking about human rights, how do they understand their role for human rights, and then use this initial mapping exercise as an engagement tool to hopefully have a more detailed conversation with them about what does it mean for a bank to commit to respect human rights. So I think this is an industry that is still very much at the beginning of understanding their human rights role. There's a lot of talk about sustainable finance broadly, but the human rights element, I think, still needs to be developed further. And the second project is about sustainable sourcing of cobalt from the Congo. It sounds very specific, but this is actually a huge topic for example, commodity trading firms that respond to an increasing demand for key battery components. And cobalt is a key battery component, for example, in electronic vehicles. And with the demand rising, there's no way around the Congo, because over 65% of the current global cobalt production takes place in the Congo. So we need to figure out how can we source from a country like the Congo, which has crisis regions, which has high poverty and corruption levels, in a way that is responsible.
And we recently had Glencore announcing the closure of one of its mines. Yeah. So how are you working with Swiss commodity firms like Glencore?
Yeah, so I'm keen to work with companies and to understand how do they innovate their business models so that profits and principles can coexist. That is sort of the red line that should run through all our sectoral work. And in the Congo specifically, I've looked at at a pilot project set up by Trafigura in collaboration with the mining company there called Shemaf. And it's a site called Mutoshi, where they integrate so-called artisanal miners to contribute contribute to the extraction of cobalt in a way that is profitable. So it's not charity on behalf of the company. They're integrating artisanal miners to in the production of cobalt. And this is innovative because typically those artisanal miners are not allowed on large mining concessions. And considering the poverty levels in that particular region of the Congo, it's the so-called copper belt, we need to create some jobs for those communities. A lack of jobs actually leads them to do so-called illegal artisanal mining on those large mining concessions. It's a business reality, and that won't go away. So finding a way to integrate them in the formal supply chain, I think, is a way to ensure responsible sourcing that is profitable yet respectful of human rights, considering the local communities there. And I'm keen to understand how could this project be scaled and replicated, and other commodity traders could adapt and adopt it too.
So that brings me on to my next question. How do you reconcile at the center academia with business practice? How are you putting into practice some of the research that will take place under the center, and actually collaborating with businesses to help them in this field?
First of all, I'm really happy to be at an academic institution because it's a really neutral platform that is sometimes beneficial for bringing all important stakeholders to the table. The type of research we do is not focused on academic publications. They're quite specific in their style. And we're keen to conduct research that comes from practice. So the research questions are the true human rights challenges for corporations. We want to work with corporations to understand those challenges, but also with other stakeholders. And for that, the academic platform is fantastic. But then we do our very rigorous research independently of anybody. But then we come back to the practitioners and say, this is what we found, and we come back to them with very concrete and practical recommendations. This is a model that we've started at NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights. We've published reports that are accessible to a broad audience, and I think that was very successful in terms of advancing human rights in policymaking and in corporate practice, because it's a format that reaches a much larger audience than an academic publication. But for the sake of bringing the key informants and key stakeholders to the table, the academic platform is really very, very important.
And how prominent is human rights in business education at the moment? You mentioned that this is actually the first center in Europe.
Yes, so we are the first center in Europe. NYU Stern was the first center in the US, and 2 schools are not enough to turn around business education. So we've actually created a network of business schools that we consider our allies in advancing human rights and business education as a group. We've had 2 meetings here in Geneva. We will have a 3rd one later this month, and we've actually brought together all the resources we are aware of that could help us to make the case that human rights are a part of business. They're business relevant, they're relevant for reputational and operational risks, but there are also opportunities. And those resources that the group has assembled will be put together in the form of a toolkit which we will publish probably early next year. So we want to use this toolkit to convince many, many more schools to think about business human rights impact and include human rights in core business teaching at business schools, because it's a new challenge, and those future managers, to be prepared for their jobs, I think they need to be aware of that human rights dimension.
You mentioned earlier, holding businesses accountable has become an increasing area of attention in promoting human rights. Yeah. What's the driver behind this? Why has it become such a big topical issue? Is it that because of globalization, companies growing in economic status? I mean, what are some of the drivers behind that?
So I think the bigger picture behind this is that unfortunately, if we look around the world, governments that are supposed to protect human rights are often not doing their job. Then you look around, who's the next resourceful actor in the room, and it's corporations. So It's actually born out of the fact that there are a growing number of so-called fragile states around the world. There's a think tank called Fund for Peace that actually tracks the number of fragile states, color codes them, and if you look over time, the world map really becomes increasingly orange and red, meaning increasingly fragile. And if we can't rely on governments alone to protect basic human rights, it's corporations that are expected to step up and ensure through their business processes that basic human rights have a chance. And accountability, I think, is the ultimate objective that we all have. And with a globalized economy and technology, greater transparency, I think businesses no longer have the chance to hide bad practices, because now even a worker in a sweatshop has a cell phone, can connect through the internet with an international NGO that can run a campaign against a large brand within hours, actually.
But so people would argue that actually companies still have room to hide, which is why we've seen 60 or so NGOs here launch the Responsible Business Initiative, which Parliament in Switzerland is currently debating. They might, we're expecting them to launch a kind of counter proposal to this, which would hold companies accountable here and overseas for their business practices. Do you think this is, companies should be held legally accountable, or should it be on a voluntary basis?
I think if you have an arsenal of weaponry, that's ideal. So legal accountability for a lot of civil society organizations is the ultimate goal. But I've worked in so many contexts where what was on paper wasn't the problem. I've been working in countries like China and Bangladesh where they have fairly robust labor laws on paper, but the problem is the implementation. So even if you put the mandatory human rights due diligence in the Swiss legal code, the implementation question is still there. So our center is keen to help corporations to make practical progress on human rights. And so we work directly on those implementation questions. The legal context, I think, is very important for companies. They operate in a microcosmos here in Switzerland, but also globally. And the legalization of human rights is a global trend. There are many other companies that are thinking about creating a law, or that have already created one, like in France, the Loi de Vigilance. And it's important for companies to see that human rights are moving to the top of the agenda for policymakers, and that really helps organizations and centers like us to then say, well, we can help you to make this real, because it really goes beyond the commitment of respecting human rights. The question then is, how does it become part of your daily business operations?
So it could set a precedent, you think?
Yes, generally I think this initiative in Switzerland is excellent because, as I said, it's putting human rights on top of corporate agendas. But for me, the question remains, what do industry-specific standards look like? And these have yet to be developed. If you have mandatory due diligence is a very broad and vague term. So what does it mean for a company that is in the commodity trading sector, or a company in the finance sector, or a company in the technology sector? What are those specific expectations for a company in these specific industry contexts? This has yet to be fleshed out. And I'm hoping to contribute to the actual operationalization of human rights due diligence.
I wanted to ask you specifically about the role of the NGO community here in Geneva and the growing role that China's been playing here. How can we hold countries like China to account for their human rights record when we also see them grow in diplomatic influence here?
I think this is a general question. How can we work with governments that don't fully respect human rights as we wish, yet they're very influential, they're big markets, they're engaged in various UN bodies here? I think human rights can create a floor upon which we can have also critical discussions with such governments and say, well, if we want businesses to operate in your markets, there are certain standards that need to be respected. And I think Geneva could play a strong role here in having such critical conversations with governments, generally governments that are not fully respecting very basic human rights. Companies then need to figure out on a case-by-case basis, I would argue, how can they continue business in, let's say, conflict regions or autocratic regimes, repressive regimes, in a way that still upholds their commitment to human rights. And that, I think, is a decision that needs to be made case by case.
And is that a conversation that you're seeing take place here in Geneva? Have you yourself come across that, this challenge?
So here at the center, I would really like to host conversations about such difficult decisions, because leaving a country or boycotting a country is often the worst human rights outcome for the local communities there. So I think from a human rights perspective, that's often the very last resort. So I would like to make it work with companies, and they shouldn't make this decision all by themselves. And just to give you an example, there's you know about the evidence that came about genocide in Myanmar. Well, Myanmar is a big producer of gemstones like jade, and the luxury industry here needs these gemstones for their jewelry designs. And I would love to have a conversation with jewelry brands here. How can you continue sourcing this essential ingredient for your jewelry designs in a way that is respectful for human rights from countries like Myanmar? Has a line been crossed for Myanmar? Do we need to stop sourcing from there for the time being, because there are also legal requirements at the time? Or can we make it work? And that applies to any the conflict region, any country where these decisions shouldn't be made by companies just by themselves, but where the Geneva Center could help to bring key stakeholders to the table.
Are you working with any other organizations here in Geneva, like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development or the UN?
A fantastic, rich environment here. I think our unique contribution is the business perspective, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I've been having a couple of conversations with them. We may set up a training for corporate practitioners together eventually next year, I hope. I'm also working with the Global Battery Alliance in the context of the Congo project. That's a multi-stakeholder initiative hosted at the World Economic Forum. I think there are many, many collaboration partners in Geneva, but also generally in Switzerland, in academia and outside. So it's really a fantastic place to start this project.